This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Dr. Matthew, you talked a bit about comorbidities, and certainly I have a concern with respect to cannabis use and psychosis associated with that. Maybe you could comment on your experience with how prevalent that is in society these days.
Thank you for the question. So for cannabis, legalized cannabis use in Canada, and what we've seen is an increase in cannabis use disorder. We've also seen an increase in ER visits for psychosis related to cannabis. So legalization with cannabis hasn't decreased that. However, there does have to be a balance struck. So has that downside been outweighed by the upside of decreased criminalization of people who are using cannabis? And so I'd leave it to policymakers to decide that. But there does seem to be upsides and downsides for legalization.
And Dr. Matthew, you talked a bit about psychosis associated with methamphetamine use. And in your experience, and if you don't have experience around this, I'm happy to ask someone else, but is it the same type of psychosis you would see, say, with schizophrenia or with cannabis use disorder?
So this is going to be a large question, but psychosis is a symptom. And so psychosis is a loss of touch with reality. So these could be fixed false beliefs, which are delusions, or it could be hallucinations, which are false sensory perceptions, or you could have disorganized thought. Now, whether someone has an intrinsic organic psychiatric illness like schizophrenia, or whether they have a substance-induced psychosis such as cannabis-induced psychosis or amphetamine-induced psychosis, it's actually very difficult to tell these apart clinically. And one thing that we have found is that people can have psychosis that is substance-induced that lasts a very long time. So the textbook that we use for in psychiatry, the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual, would describe a substance-induced psychosis as 1 month long. However, with recent research from Shaw et al., what they found is that 80% of cannabis-induced psychosis will last longer than a month. And we know that amphetamine-induced psychosis, 27% will last longer than a month. So it's actually very common for these psychoses to last longer than a month. And then clinically, it's very difficult to tease these two apart. And it ends up being that the treatment is the same. So you would use antipsychotic medication to treat both.
And Dr. Matthew, thank you for that. Through you, Chair, to Dr. Matthew again. When we're talking about making the diagnosis of someone who has substance use disorder and a concomitant mental health illness, let's just put it generically as psychosis, is it possible to tell those apart when the person is continuing to use their substance of choice?
So there was a study, and the author's name escapes me right now, but what they looked at was folks who came into addiction treatment facility. And they used a scale, it's called the Brief Severity Index, and they looked at different types of psychiatric symptoms such as depression, anxiety, paranoia, and they call it psychoticism. And what they found was that everybody that came into this addiction treatment facility, 39% had psychiatric symptoms. However, 1 month into sobriety, that dropped 13-fold to 3%. And that 3% held steady 6 months out. And so this is what's recommended in the DSM, which I mentioned earlier, is that you should wait a month into sobriety before diagnosing a psychiatric illness. So answering your question, if someone is currently using substances and they don't have a month of sobriety and you don't have a longitudinal history or clinical records, it's very difficult to make a psychiatric diagnosis before they've had that time in sobriety.
Thank you very much for that. And but if I understood you correctly, through you, Chair, Dr. Matthew, you would suggest treating that person, for instance, with medication to treat the psychosis, even though they continue to actively use their substance of choice.
Yes. So for antipsychotic medication, what you will find is that if someone has a substance-induced psychosis and they have an antipsychotic medication on board, the antipsychotic medication won't prevent them from becoming psychotic. Earlier in my talk, I talked about a kindling effect. that occurred with substance use. And what happens is, as I mentioned earlier, you'll become psychotic during intoxication, and that extends into sobriety, which extends into, and it becomes more severe. So it actually prevents that progression from happening, and that's the benefit of it. Also, if someone is acutely psychotic, it will help treat their acute psychotic symptoms.
Thank you very much, Dr. Matthew. And through you, Chair, I do have a motion I'd like to move. That motion being that given that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's dangerous experiment of the decriminalization of drugs such as cocaine, crack, methamphetamines, fentanyl, and more in British Columbia has resulted in a significant increase in deadly drug overdoses and compromised the safety of Canadians, the current drug decriminalization experiment has resulted in carnage and chaos, causing detrimental impacts on public health and community safety. Last week, British Columbia's Premier David Eby has recognized the failings of the experiment and called on the federal government to help them backtrack out of this reckless policy decision. The City of Toronto has made a request to Health Canada asking for drug decriminalization, referring to it as the Toronto model. Drugs would be legal to use everywhere except childcare centres, K-12 schools, and airports. Canadians from coast to coast have been calling for the end of decriminalization, knowing that it is a recovery-oriented system that leads to saving lives, rebuilding families, and eliminating chaos. The committee report to the House its recommendation that the government immediately dismantle all drug decriminalization programs in Canada. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ellis. The motion touches on the subject matter that we are now considering, so it is therefore in order. Given that we're studying the opioid epidemic and toxic drug crisis, so I rule the motion in order, and the debate is therefore on the motion. Dr. Hanley, and then Mr. Doherty.
I think the motion, although in order, is not something that we need to debate on right now. What we really need is to hear testimony from the witnesses. I suggest that this is a frivolous motion, and I hereby move to adjourn debate.
Motion to adjourn debate is a non-debatable dilatory motion that must proceed directly to a vote. So the question for the committee is, shall the debate be adjourned? All those in favor of adjourning debate, hands please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All those opposed to adjourning debate, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, the motion is adopted. The debate is adjourned.